Hi, Tomás. It's a pleasure having you here. I mean, you have an amazing background already. I know that you write really good columns. I'm a big fan of your columns in Diario Financiero. And I know that you just released a new book. Do you want to tell us a
That's
little
right.
bit about the book?
Well, the book is sort of like an account and a history of where the company as a social institution is coming from and where it's going, right? So this comes from my, let's say, aim of like delivering something positive to society. And after college, a long time ago, right? I thought about like maybe going to politics or going to NGOs or a public sector or whatever. And I realized that it was actually like the market, the place where I saw a lot of potential in, right? And then after 15 years of experience there, I realized that the whole narrative around the companies, it's sort of like the wrong one, right? Like everything that we usually study in a textbook or the classic, let's say, Friedman phrase around profit being the only sole purpose of a company, it was sort of obsolete, it was outdated, and there was a need for like sort of like a new statement and understanding where companies are truly going, where they're heading, right? And so, well, the book is trying to describe that, try to understand the trends behind it, trying to understand the challenges that companies are facing when they relate with their different stakeholders, and also in a very, let's say, Darwinian way. This is not a proposal. This is sort of like an understanding of what's going on while companies are trying to survive and to succeed in the market.
Yeah, one of the questions I had for you was how do you see these boundaries between companies' inner space and the outer space, their ecosystem around them? Like, where would you place these boundaries, and why? And what
Mm.
stakeholders do you think are most important for companies today? Because
Well,
of
I think that
influence or because
that's a great question. I think that's a great question because I think that boundaries are sort of blurring, right? Before, companies were conceived in a very structured way, sort of like a closed organization, right? And little by little, with a more collaborative or network economy, right, we're going towards a more an open system approach, right? So cases as Google itself or Airbnb or Uber or whatever, who is like actually harnessing the power of a crowd, right, is realizing that an open system performs better than a closed organization, right? And when you see the company as a system, and especially as an open one, you realize that it's very hard to establish a clear boundary with their community, with their client, with their even there's any other stakeholder, right? Because any client, sometimes it's a supplier, sometimes it's a client, sometimes it's a neighbor. So each one of us playing different roles with the same company or with the same institution makes things more tricky, right? And I think that actually is sort of pushing companies' strategy towards having the same value proposal to each one or to every stakeholder.
I find it really interesting how in your book you talk about companies as new political vehicles. And well, I'm also wondering, well, what you had in mind when you wrote this idea, and what do you see? How do you see this accelerating in the future and shaping
Mhm,
the new economy, especially after
mhm.
this context
Well,
that we're living in and this.
I agree that it's sort of like a daring idea and a daring proposal, but it's important to understand that I don't mean I don't mean that they are going to become, let's say, partisan in some way, right? But ultimately, as what we understand as politics in the acception of saying we as members of a society organizing ourselves and driving whatever we want in the way that we believe is the right one, right? So when we realize that companies are so, let's say, determinant in the future of our societies and in the way that we shape society, we realize that they have like a big saying. They're like a protagonist in this movie, right? However, they are not held many times accountable for that, right? And what I see that is happening is that every day more different stakeholders are holding companies accountable, like clients, communities, investors, especially employees, right? They're going to say to the companies, and they're saying, hey, you should be doing this because this is what I believe, right? And that's the tricky thing, is when an employee or a client is demanding their company to do something because it needs to agree with their beliefs, with their vision of society. Basically, you're asking the company to be political, right? Because you want to see your project, your ideals, you want to see them being executed by a certain company, either in your position as a client, as an investor, or as an employee, right? So if tomorrow companies are going to start, let's say, taking orders somehow, right, from us, sorry, regarding what we believe is a better society, that's a whole new market, right? Market stop being about only or mere transactions just to satisfy ourselves, but we're going to start demanding both, right? I want a good product for satisfying the initial promise, but I want you to run your organization and to have an impact align with my beliefs, with my values, right? And usually, or historically, that demand, I used to ask it to a politician, to a political party, to a government, not to
Yes.
a company. So it's sort of like a big innovation that we as a society are holding companies accountable for what we believe in.
I completely agree. And I would like to add a new dimension to that thing that you just said. I guess you're familiar with Professor Philip Kotler.
Sure.
He speaks about marketing 3.0 and this idea that the new value proposition for companies. I mean, before it used to be, functional, then turned into functional and emotional, but now we're talking about a value proposition that is functional, emotional, and spiritual, right? When we talk about these values, in a way, we're also like thinking about the human being, not only as a whole human with mind and heart, but also with spirit, right? And these are the values that, and not only the spirit, but also this harmony with the world that surrounds us, right? So really being able to acknowledge this crack in that we are living in our daily lives at work, in the way we consume everything, saying, okay, I do care about others, I do care about the environment, but the things that I'm doing are somehow like going in contradiction with this.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's pretty funny because somehow the dream of any marketeer came true, but with consequences that were not foreseen, right? Uh, let's say 10, 20 years ago, the same that Professor Kotler is saying, it was like classically put in a ladder, right? You will go and say, well, if you want to convince someone to buy my product, you need to position yourself. And it was the whole concept about positioning a brand, right? As either this is going to be price value because you're going to be super cheap or super expensive and just you're going to be exclusive by being so, or it's going to be functional, or it's going to be emotional, or ultimately you're going to appeal to the values and to the lifestyle of someone, right? And the classic example, for example, was Patagonia, right? The garment and the clothes company. And it was interesting because people go and say, well, I buy my jeans or my jacket from Patagonia because I think that it's more sustainable and I share the values with them, right? And it was perfect because Patagonia was also living it, right? It was being consistent, it was being consequent with the value proposal of it. The problem is that when you have a huge corporation saying that they are something, right? They are like, even, I mean, I don't know, they're super honest, or they're super inclusive, or they're being super diverse, or like whatever value you want to appeal for, you can no longer lie, right? You cannot just make a nice tagline or a good marketing commercial, right? In that way, advertising is sort of dying, right? Because today happen two things. People, we take decisions based mostly on peer reviews,
Mm-hmm.
right? We see, and today we can read what other people think about their experience, and we can see if it's true, right? But at the same time, this over information age, what it's bringing us is that companies somehow are transparent, right? You cannot hide things in a packaging anymore. Because if you tell me that you're super clean and you're, I don't know, selling me your toothpaste, and you're swearing me that it's made out of bamboo with like a lot of organic materials, but then in the news, I can see that your factory somewhere is doing some other products that they're not bamboo based and
Yes.
they're like super toxic, that's it. Your brand is destroyed. So what happens is that the best marketing a company can make today is being a different company and being a company that is aligned with the value proposal that you're proposing. So culture, strategy of the operation
Mm-hmm.
needs to be aligned with the value proposal. And in that way, advertising cannot be a claim anymore, but it has to be the essence of a company.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but that's something we always do at Terra. We talk about implemented sustainability. It's not something that you comply with, that you just check. It's not like another vertical department of your company that you
That's
just.
right.
It's it's more about using it as a force of constant innovation, and it's going to be embedded in each process of the company, where each employee is going to use it as a common sense, like a common sense resource every time they make a decision, and
That's right.
that's where you actually start enacting these values, right? And yeah, we call it a 360-degree implementation, because it involves everything in the whole. If we think about a business as a sphere, right, it involves
Mhm.
every little inch of that sphere, and that's where the strength of this change brings this energy that you see everywhere in a culture of organization. So when you go to these companies like Patagonia, you can feel it. You can feel it in the corridor, right?
Sure.
And I was going to ask you something more about that. Do you think it's a little bit controversial, but do you think that today we're asking for more accountability from the private sector, from companies,
Mhm.
than from politicians? Like, how do you see that?
I see that somehow society sort of gave up with politicians, and it's a very sad thing to say because I truly believe that politicians are super important, and it's essential for any democracy
Mm,
to have good political parties and people to participate in public events and public institutions. However, they sort of saw that they were like focusing all the attention on the dysfunctional organization, and then they realized, but while these guys are not being able to do what they promised, you have all these other guys running and doing anything they want, right? Which are companies, right? And basically society is seeing an opportunity. They're realizing that companies are a much more effective tool for change.
mm,
So they say, I mean, if you would have one bullet, or if you will have just like one opportunity, to whom you put in charge the future of the world, right? Is it going to be politicians? Or if you could make companies comply with the project of society that you have, would you put it in charge of companies? And probably you would do the latter, right?
mm,
Because you realize that their flexibility, the way they are constructed, and the accountability they have is much bigger, right? When we as consumer or as talent, right, we decide not to work for them,
yes.
it's a very direct interpellation, a very direct message, and you can make them go bankrupt
Mhm.
in a few months, right? When you don't approve a government, they're still going to be there for a while,
Hmm.
right? And I think that sort of dynamic, which all I'm saying has like a lot of nuance, right? And I'm just trying to simplify the argument, but in the essence, sort of like beneath it, there's this new feeling of society saying, you know what? I see that companies are a better vehicle for change. They can enact it in a much more effective way.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Well, that's a
And
brilliant
and
answer.
I think a good example,
Yeah.
and I think a good example is what's been going on lately with a few companies, right? Like last year, when there was like the whole unrest around Black Lives Matter, you saw how many companies took a stand. They pick a side, right? They went and said, you know what, we support this cause. And that certainly means that all the white supremacists are not going to buy them anymore, but they took a stand, right? And it's pretty weird. Like, why Nike would make like a great commercial about saying, for once, don't do it. Don't be indifferent to hatred, to be indifferent to violence, to be indifferent to discrimination, because again, they are taking a stand in a very political issue. Or like a few years ago when it was all the refugee crisis with Syria, while some companies, sorry, while some countries were closing the borders, Starbucks went and said, well, I'm going to hire, I think it was 10,000 refugees, right? So again, it was Starbucks making a very clear and bold political action and sort of defying the government, right? So, and again, that means that today you got a lot of people who it's more loyal to Starbucks, right? And they want to work there, they want to buy there, they want to invest in there, right? And it's going to be the same with Airbnb and some other companies that have done these bold actions. And it's the same, in the other hand, when, for example, there's been some accusation of, let's say, gender discrimination in some companies. Companies rapidly take action because they know that they're not going to be supported, right? So you see how, again, these political values or political issues are taking place within companies and even in a very public role.
That's a very good point, Tomás. Very, very good point. And yes, and from another point of view, also the role of um, customers as of the state, right? Of like we're so used to to a new role of customers that we are practicing like every day more, like saying more our opinion, speaking out loud, being heard like in this very moment by thanks to the social media and all of these new channels that we have. And it's like the I don't like using the word consumers, but the customers in our new role, I feel like it's affecting the way we take this new role as customers. It's affecting also the way we demand from the state, from the different states and the government. What do you think? Isn't that shifting as well?
You mean the demands towards the government?
The way we demand things from the government is like we're so used to this new role of customers that can demand things immediately to company.
Yeah. No, I get it now. I get it now. I get it now. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I totally agree. And I totally agree. And again, what I'm going to say is going to be very unpopular. It's even a little bit childish, right? Because we are always constantly demanding without actually knowing enough. And I think that's part of the problem is that all the social network and all the, let's say, the current age of over information, we always have the impression that we're well aware of everything when we're not. And it's just like quite the opposite. We just know a little bit on something, but because we saw a few memes, we think that we are just like experts on it, right? And it's a problem, right? Because every time that the government do something, we immediately have an opinion, and immediately we go outrage saying something on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, when we don't even understand the fundamentals. I'm not talking about like the technical aspect of it or just like the details of it. It's just like the fundamentals, the basics. And I think that, yeah, it's just like, just as you said, we got so used to client that we always have to be right, and we always need to be listened, that we, let's say, I think we sort of lose the ability of engaging into good dialogue, into good conversations, into truly understanding all the trade-off of certain decisions, of really understanding the other human being who is like in front of me trying to make another point. And that lack of capacity end up harming our citizenship, right? And yeah, well, that's a pretty bad scenario.
Yes, I agree. There's yeah, I just when you were talking this when you were saying that, I was thinking about, yes, embracing complexity, right? It seems like with because of the acceleration of changes in our societies and this yeah, we are constantly
Mm,
bombarded by all these whole COVID, Brexit, you know, you name it. But we are caught in that
mm,
change in a way that we're not, it's so fast that we're not able to catch up with the complexity of the topics we're talking about, because everything is so interlinked today. And yes, and what we keep
mm,
seeing is that there's a polarization of the opinions, right? So it's easier to get into one of these polarizations than to really take yeah, the path of the middle, and trying to you know, be neutral, and try to go deeper into the complexity of what we're seeing. And
mm,
I feel like, yeah, the governments are in a very tough position in that sense, because they are very, so they are facing more demand because it's more direct. Like we say, there's this new role of
mm,
citizens that asked us as as customers, but at the same
mhm,
time, they still have these old structures, these old cultures.
mhm,
They're not able to adapt and be flexible to all of these changes that are going on. So there is like, I mean, there's not only the, I mean, it's by default an opportunity for companies
mhm.
to step out and and do something. What do you think about that? Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, if you think it through, the
Hmm.
current government and state structure respond to a social technical paradox of 200 years ago, right? The way chambers, government, hierarchies, everything is designed in a way, all the processes, thinking of the 1800s or the 1700s even, right? And it has not been updated really. It have been updated certain rights, certain rules, but not the overall system, the way the system it's assembled and works, right? And that means that it's basically obsolete, right? So they are not being able to cope with the new expectations of society, with the aim for dialogue, for the aim of participation, for the aim of things needed to be done in 2 seconds, for for all of that, right? And today you see um, how companies are in a better position are and are more capable of doing so, right? And again, that's sort of like a very tricky place to be when you're in government, when you're in the public sphere, because you are constrained by a set of rules that they were designed 200 years ago. And when you want to change those rules, you need to go through a long process in Congress. And then once the rules are out there, probably they are already outdated again, right? Instead of companies, that the governance structure that they have is much more agile, right? And even so, that you still see how startups are challenging big corporations, because the corporations, although they could be much more faster than a government, they're still much more slower than a startup, right? But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I think that
it
we
feels
have
like
like a great deal of a challenge as a society in terms of like
yes.
the governance structure that we have and the participation, because there's a big crave for participation, but the vehicles for it are not in place.
Yes. And what do you think when, because I know you did a lot of research and you know a lot about different companies that have been leading the way in this way. What do you think are the key, or what do you detect are the key factors in the mindset of leaders of this? Sorry, yeah. What do you think are the key factors in the mindset of the leaders of these businesses or organizations that make them do that shift? Um, is there a common thread that you found there?
I think that it's just reality, and I think it's just like the basic instinct for survival. I mean, all these, and part of what I discussed in the book, is not necessarily philanthropy. Is basically the need for survival in order to do the right thing to do, right? So that's why they end up doing this, right? It's a need.
Hmm.
It's not that they are just like wanting to be better. It's
Hmm.
just that the market is demanding so, clients are demanding so, investors are demanding so, and they are basically coping with it. The problem with the ones who are not being able to do so is because they are stuck in the old paradigm and they don't want to move out from there.
Yes. And is there a pattern that you can detect on the structures that these companies build?
Well, I'm not sure if I've detected like a new pattern. I just see that they're all struggling with the old one. And although there are certain proposals that they are laid out in many different books and research, like again, going from a pyramid towards sort of like a network where you don't have like someone on top, but you are able to differentiate like in a very good way which are the different roles. And for example, then the CEO is not longer like the boss of everyone, but it start being, let's say, the coordinator of everyone, right? But
Yes.
not necessarily making always the last shot. I think it's sort of like the way to go. But there, you need to fight back all the resistance from a lot of people who are just like powerful in the old model, right? And they feel comfortable there, and that's the way they know. And you see how these companies, when they try to migrate to a new model, many times you have a lot of casualties, right? Because of people who is just not able to cope with this new model, they don't want to adapt, and they end up leaving. And usually that transition is very costly, both in times and in resources.
Yes. Yes.
But it's a way to go if you want to survive, right?
Yes. I'm always thinking about, well, being part of Startup Chile, Startup Chile, you're familiar with it. And with all of, with the startup culture, it is true that what's really attractive about it, it's the freedom that you feel, especially if you come from a corporate sector, right?
Mm-hmm.
You feel really free, but then you're powerless compared to these corporations, and even more powerless compared to government, right? There is like a different degree of sense of power. I mean, the sense of influence and in the sense of resources, etc. But you can go a lot, you can sprint compared to them. They run or they walk.
Yeah, I mean, you can sprint, but let me say two things which I think are super important. First, that freedom comes from let's say a different premise, and the premise that people is trusting you, right? In a startup, they trust you, and that's why they let you do whatever you want, because they know that you're not going to be stealing around or just like not doing anything or whatever. While in the classic old corporation, they needed like to surveil you because they basically didn't trust you. And because I don't trust you is that I have a controller and I have like all this control mechanism, right? The interesting thing is that when that startup that is built in their processes, their culture, and their organizational structure based on trust, is that they can actually keep sprinting after a while, right? So that powerless feeling, right, start being replaced by, I'm getting better and I'm getting bigger and I'm being able to change a lot of things. But still, when you were a startup and you were a little guy, you were able to do things differently, right? The interesting thing is that still, if you grow and you mature and you become like a big corporation, but you're not, let's say, as good as you used to be, you're going to get in trouble. And I think a good example is what's going on with Facebook, right? Facebook is not only subject of the critic from politicians, but also from their customers and from their investors, right? And when people start like pulling the money out because they say, you know what, you're in an area and you're not solving it, you keep messing it up, and you need to deal with the freedom of press, and you need to deal with, let's say, other social things that matters, but you are not acknowledging those, you go into trouble, although you could be super fast.
That's a very good point. That's a really, really good example. And yes, and then and I have another question connected to this, but what about corporations that want to embed these new cultures, and they do that by these aqua hires or entrepreneurs, hiring entrepreneurs to bring this culture from within. I mean, that is another process, right? And I feel, I don't know if you have any examples of this, but the people that I know that have been doing this, they really, really struggle because they are like, they are the bridge between these two cultures, and there's a lot of pressure on their shoulders.
Yeah, Yeah, I totally agree. It is a big challenge, but I think that there's a good case that is Accenture. Well, I used to work in Accenture, so I kind of like know the story there. But it's interesting how Accenture, 10 years ago or even more, they took like a quite aggressive approach to work towards inorganic growth, right? So they start like having like a very frequent process of M&A, and they were just like purchasing companies. But during the let's say 4 first years, they really had like a bad track record because they basically were spending a lot of money in companies that they were destroying, right? And they were destroying them because when they were acquiring them, they actually were ripping them away from their culture, right? So all the reasons why they were so good, that ability to be fast, all that trust, all that, again, lots of details in what constitutes an organization, they were accenturizing them, and they were like making them part of a big corporation, right? And that's when they realize and they say, you know what, like we really need these guys, that there's a reason why we buy them. We really need to change the approach. And if you see the last 10 years of Accenture buying companies, it's been very successful. And it's been very successful because they realized that they needed to work more as a system, and they needed to be a culture of cultures. So you just cannot aim for being such a big corporation with one single culture. And they have a strategy, a deliberate strategy of being a culture of different cultures, with certain in place mechanisms that let you, let's say, run the company, but at the same time allow different ways of doing things so you can keep the value alive.
That is really interesting. I never heard about that, and it's really interesting. Culture of cultures. Wow.
Well, actually, if you realize, Accenture today is the second, I don't know how to say, but it's the second company that buys most companies in the world after Google. I mean, Google buys a company every month. Accenture buys a company every 6 weeks, something like that.
So they are acquiring talent or cultures.
That's right.
That's our strategy. Okay.
Well, I mean, it's cultures,
Mhm.
talents, and also like the cradle of a solution, right? That then they can expand, and they can actually leverage in all their networks to do something better or bigger out of it.
Amazing. Amazing. Okay, this is so interesting already, but I want to ask you the last question. But I really like the analysis you do on companies that we're saying that are really like changing the system, the way the system works, like like Tesla, Facebook,
Mhm.
etc. So I wanted to ask you for like one of the examples that or two examples of companies that are really representing the challenges that we're facing today, and how they're dealing with it, like the biggest challenges. Do you have anything in the top of your mind for this?
Um, well, Tesla is always like a good option because it's not only just like electric cars, but their philosophy of giving up the patents and stuff like that. It's very like walking the talk, right? I think today also we have like a big push of and I think that probably those are the ones going to give us a lot to talk about in the coming years, right? Because the food industry is just like enormous, right? We
Which industry?
all have
Sorry,
the
you
tendency
just,
to
you
eat,
just,
right?
you just
And
got it. So can you repeat
the,
that again?
the food industry,
Ah, the food industry. Oh yes, I love the food industry.
food
Yes,
industry,
yes, I love food.
yeah. Yeah, so the food industry I think is going to give us a lot to talk about because you can see from the range of these companies like Beyond Meat or Notco or other companies who are doing meat that is not meat, but all the way to all the companies that they are doing protein out of insects, for example, on bugs. And it's interesting that it's apparently the way to go, and it's really going to disrupt the way we eat, and it's going to change the value change, and it's going to change all these huge paradox that we know today, right? That if we feed the whole world with the standards that Europe and the US is being fed today, the world just cannot cope with it, right? if India or China would eat the amount of meat that Italians do,
forget about the planet.
it just doesn't
We
work.
need like 10 planets for that.
Right? The planet cannot cope with it. So you have like you have a big, yeah. So you have like a big environmental pressure that industry it's needing to solve, and probably will solve it, right? It will solve it by entrepreneurs and innovations who are going to design new ways of pleasing us as customers. At the same time, that there are going to be a lot of activists that are going to be there, right? Because that's the other thing. Today, you realize that being a good activist probably is going to be more useful if you're within a company than if you're in the streets and you're actually delivering a new solution, right? And the good news for all this is that those companies do perform better because you decrease the risk of a company when that company is being responsible and doesn't have issues with communities, doesn't have issues with their suppliers, and on the other hand, is well aligned with their suppliers, with their employees, with the clients, right? So they end up performing better. There are a few studies on that, but those are the good news, right? So again, this is Darwin. Like companies want to survive, and they're going to do whatever is best for their survival, and luckily is also best for all of us.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it's incredible, but the problem is not so much because a lot of people say, oh, I have to, this is going to cost me so much and do all of these changes and changing the processes, etc. But in the end, it even saves a lot of money. And not only that, but it can increase the share of the market, etc. So there's all of these benefits that are on the other side of the road, and it's just fear stopping them from reaching there. And it's I think it's really good, Tomás, what you're doing, like talking about this, in especially in the finance sector, right? I think the finance sector is awakening a lot. I mean, we see it in the newspapers now. They're talking about ESGs, they're talking about circular economy, they're talking about these topics, more and more increasingly. And I think we are in this, we are navigating this change, and it's better to surf the wave than to be crushed by it, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's the way to go. And ultimately, it's for survival, right? If not, those companies are going to go bankrupt. Unless you're like truly super, super powerful and you are going to be able to be, let's say, bad and still have customers and still have talent and still have investors. But that doesn't seem very, very feasible.
Yes. Yes, and I'm always also encouraging people not to say only like, okay, I do sustainability, this is enough. It's not about arriving to a destination. It's about embracing the process, and right, like
it's becoming something.
It's becoming something. Exactly.
Is walking the talk, right? It goes from the core of your beliefs in the board, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Tomás. This has been really, really inspiring. And it's been a pleasure talking to you, as always.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Lucia, for the invitation. It's great to have these conversations, and ultimately, all these ideas are going to evolve, right? And it's a challenge how to implement them and how to make the change, because it's for the best of all of us. So thank you very much.